Geneva Overholser, and I have the pleasure today of introducing our introducer, one of our own, Diane Winston, an associate professor of journalism and our Knight professor, who has brought our special guest. Diane, thank you so much.
Thank you, Geneva. Thanks everybody for coming. I want to thank the Luce Foundation for providing the funds to do this. We have today with us Caryle Murphy. Caryle was the Saudi Arabia correspondent for GlobalPost until this past June. A longtime reporter for the Washington Post, she's been a foreign correspondent both in Africa and the Middle East. In 1990, while serving as the Post bureau chief in Cairo, she was in Kuwait when Iraq invaded the emirate. She remained there for a month, hiding a lot of the time, so the Iraqi troops wouldn't see her. For this work and more, she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1991 for international reporting, as well as a George Pope Award for foreign reporting. She was the 1994 Edward R. Murrow Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations also. Murphy is the author of the 2002 book Passion for Islam, which explains Islam's contemporary revival and the roots of religious extremism in the Middle East. When she wasn't abroad, she covered the U.S. federal court, immigration policy, and religion for the Post. After leaving the Post in 2006 to pursue an independent journalism career, she helped the Post website to launch its online feature on faith. As a 2011 Knight Luce Fellow, and this is our program thanks to the Luce Foundation, where we fund reporters to write about global religion, and hopefully the site will be launched soon and everybody can go look at it. As a 2011 Knight Luce Fellow, Murphy wrote a series of articles for the GlobalPost on Saudi Arabia's export of its particular brand of Islam in the decade after 9/11. A Massachusetts native, she is a graduate of Trinity University in Washington, D.C. and Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Currently, she is a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. We've asked her today to talk about her reporting in Saudi Arabia, coverage of Islam, her career, and also to leave lots of time for questions. So again, thank you so much for coming to join us today. Caryle, it's yours.
Thank you. Well, if I do all that, we'll be here till 4 o'clock, so let me get started. When I first arrived in Saudi Arabia, I met a young man in his 30s who lived in Oregon for 7 years studying. And the reason I wanted to talk to him, or the reason he came to my attention, was because he was the first Saudi to successfully climb Mount Everest. And when he got to the top, he put down the Saudi flag, and then he made the call to prayer, which is, the signature sign of Islam around the world. If you've ever lived in a Muslim country, especially Egypt, you hear it 5 times a day. It's very beautiful. When I was in Cairo earlier, I lived in the middle of Zamalek, which is an island, and I used to go shopping at a grocery store nearby. And one day I walked in, and the guy who had been putting up all the vegetables had made this gorgeous tableau. And he had all these fresh vegetables of different colors: tomatoes, eggplant, cucumbers, yellow squash, green squash. And he put them in a pattern, and the pattern said Allah. So you can imagine if somebody at Stop and Shop did that with their vegetables here, there'd probably be somebody complaining. Then also in Saudi, one day I heard that a religious scholar from Pennsylvania, who's an expert in interfaith activities, was in Riyadh. And I couldn't believe it. I said, what on earth is he doing here? Well, it turns out he'd been invited to Riyadh by somebody at this university, which is the most conservative religious university in Saudi Arabia, to discuss interfaith issues. It was an astounding event coming from that particular university. And the last anecdote I want to tell you is, in 1991, my mother had a stroke. And when I told my Saudi friends that I was going home to help take care of her for a while, they said, oh, that's terrible, that's terrible. I'll pray for her. So I was happy to tell my mother she had more people praying for her in Saudi Arabia than she did in Massachusetts. Now, there's nothing connecting all those anecdotes except one thing, which is religion. And I think I don't have to tell you that religion plays an incredibly important role in the Middle East. It's a given. And if you're a correspondent there, you know that you're going to be reporting on religion and its influence on society and politics. So I thought today I'd give you some reflections on this subject arising from my reporting there. And first, I thought I'd begin by, let's examine why is religion playing the role it is today in the Middle East? Now, I don't want to pretend there's a short or easy answer to that, but for the purposes of our discussion today, I'm going to attempt a very superficial explanation. For centuries now, people who spoke in the name of Islam, were they clerics or writers or proselytizers, have had this theme that unlike other religions, Islam is a total way of life and it affects everything. Well, when I first heard this, I was very puzzled. Why did they say this? Because after all, a devout Muslim or a devout Jew also sees their religion as a way of life and affecting everything they do. Remember, you know the famous evangelical aphorism, what would Jesus do? You know, in every situation, what would Jesus do? So, nevertheless, I was puzzled, but I did observe that as these anecdotes showed you, that I just repeated, there's no doubt about it that ordinary Muslims see Islam as their preeminent cultural and ethical touchstone. It is pervasive in their lives. Now, it's my personal opinion that this claim that Islam is, a total way of life is, to a certain extent, an exaggeration, and it comes out of a narrative created by Muslim societies and cultures that felt that their religion and their societies were inferior to the West, because this great confrontation in the 1800s between the Arab world and Europe. Europe won because it had superior firepower. I mean, Napoleon invaded Egypt and he had all the guns. And the Muslims were taken aback. How can this happen to us? We have the best religion on earth. So I think the narrative developed that, well, Islam is, it's a total way of life and we have to stick to it. This idea of Islam being all-encompassing also, I think, was an unconscious attempt to battle or push back against secularism, which, as you know, was not with us forever and ever. I mean, in the Middle Ages, when Christianity dominated Europe, there was no idea of secularism. It arose later after the religious wars. Now, in the Middle East, secularism is very much misunderstood. People regard secularism as more like the French or the Mexican variant, which is very hostile to religion. And there's not supposed to be any recognition of religion by officialdom. The American version of secularism is far different. It simply says that government cannot infringe on religion and it will not favor any variant of religion. And as you all know, America is one of the most religiously observant countries in the world. So there's no such thing in the Middle East, and there can't be for the time being, a political party or a ruler who's overtly secular, because it just wouldn't get very far. And this is one reason why the Islamists now are coming out on top as a result of the Arab awakening that began in Tunisia a little over a year ago. Simply put, Islam sells in the political arena. And it's also because, as one of my dear Egyptian friends said, there are secular organizations and there are secular people, but there's no secular ideology. And what he meant was secularism is not the kind of belief that inspires you to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go drive voters to the polls so your party wins. But that's what Islamists do, because they have this deep, deep conviction, this deep religious faith. Now, there's another reason that religion has been so closely allied to politics in the Middle East, and the reason why it's in a bit of a trouble there today, is because since its birth in the 7th century, Islam has been used by rulers to legitimize their rule and extend their authority. Essentially, many rulers just hijacked Islam to justify their rule. And in a nutshell, this led to a constriction of the possibility for debate and intellectual creativity in Islam in the theological sphere. As a result, what do we have? We have, in the last 100, 200 years, we've had Islamic orthodoxy, very conservative orthodoxy, has had a place of privilege because Islamic orthodoxy is much easier for political leaders to control. It's much safer for them. If you have free intellectual inquiry in the theological sphere in Islam, you're going to get all sorts of ideas, all sorts of different points of view. Like you did in the early days of Islam, especially when Islam was in southern Spain. That was like the height of its creativity. So unfortunately, the conservative orthodox interpretations of the Quran and other scriptures of Islam have been dominant. It's beginning to change, and that's why Islam is so interesting today, because there's this ferment in the faith. And I'd like to make a little pitch for my book here, because there's one chapter called New Thinking in Islam. And this chapter goes into more depth of what I've been talking about now. And it talks about a guy named Abu Zayd, who was a really thoughtful, smart linguistics professor in Cairo with a special interest in reading the Quran. And he would argue, look, you can't read every verse in the Quran literally. There are some verses meant to be read metaphorically. Now, he wasn't the first person in Islam to say this, but he was very keen about it. And the Islamists in Egypt began attacking him. They took him to court. They said, well, this is a blasphemy, what he says, and since he's committing blasphemy, he's not a Muslim, therefore he can't be married to his wife, who's a good Muslim. I mean, it was an absurd case. Unfortunately, he got an Islamist judge who agreed with these people. And there were threats against his life, so he and his wife left Egypt and went to the Netherlands, where they continued their academic careers. Unfortunately, he'd be a very, very important figure today in Egypt, but he died about a year before the Arab awakening started. So what about the future? You know, the Arab awakening, I don't think is going to be, I hope that its impact will be more than political. I hope it's going to bring fresh breezes into the theological sphere of Islam in the Middle East, because it's my contention that theological reform is necessary if there's going to be true Islamist democracies. There has to be more of a push from lay people, academics, clerics, religious institutions to think of what is this great faith, what is this book that we believe in so much, the Quran. What is it telling us about our situation today? Not what is it telling us about the situation 500 years ago. What are its truths that are universal that we can apply today? For example, there has to be more in-depth analysis of the current position of Islam on freedom of conscience. I mean, why is it against the law in Egypt to change your religion away from Islam? The Quran says very explicitly, it's there in black and white, there's no compulsion in religion. And there's, on the books, it doesn't happen very often, but on the books, capital punishment applies to those who leave the faith. So how can you have a modern state if you believe in this? This is one of the areas when I say it needs more investigation, it needs more academic analysis, it needs politicians to come out and support a more modernist interpretation. There's got to be more tolerance for diversity of opinion, more respect for the individual. As one of my friends said to me, the Islamists have to realize that people deserve human rights not because they're good Muslims, but because they're human beings. And then, obviously, in the role of women, why are there such retrogressive interpretations on what's a woman's place in the world? It wasn't like that in early Islam. I mean, you can read books and books about the famous feminist figures in early Islam. So my hope is that the Arab Awakening has opened the door a bit. And I think what is important, the events in Egypt did two important things. First of all, they gave more legitimacy to the secular mindset. Why? Because all those young people in Tahrir Square who led this revolution, who forced Mubarak out, they were non-ideological. They were asking for what we might consider a very, Western secular agenda. Freedom, human rights, diversity, tolerance. But the second thing that the Arab Awakening did, it also gave legitimacy to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the most dominant Islamist party in the Middle East. Before the Arab Awakening, the Muslim Brotherhood was operating openly, but it was banned. I mean, if a member of the Muslim Brotherhood wanted to run for parliament, he had to run as an independent. Now they're operating much more openly. They've created their own political party. So in a very paradoxical way, both the secularists and the Islamists have been given new potency by the Arab Awakening. Now, I know it doesn't look like that because of the result of the elections recently in Egypt, where the Islamists are getting a lot of the vote. But I still think that the secularists have much more potency than they had before. So what I hope will happen, what I hope is going to happen in the next decade or so, that these two forces are going to have a more realistic dialogue with each other. I don't mean they're going to be seminars or conferences like this one. I mean through the push and pull of daily political life, that secularists and Islamists in a place like Egypt are going to have a much more vigorous interchange, much more public debate involving citizens, and so that they come to a new kind of understanding of the place of Islam in public life. That's what's at stake here. What is the place of Islam in public life? And most Middle Eastern countries have not yet figured that out. I'm not alarmed by a lot of writers by the fact that the Islamist parties seem to have gained a lot of support in the elections. The reasons I'm not alarmed is, first of all, these are not violent parties. They're not Al-Qaeda. In fact, Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood are very, very much enemies. Secondly, these Islamist parties, getting into parliament is going to force them, for the first time, they're going to have to come up with realistic economic policies. Not pie in the sky. We want Islamic finance and Islamic state. Well, what do you mean by that? Tourism is the top revenue maker for Egypt. So are they going to ban alcohol completely? I don't think so, because tourism would drop a lot. How are they going to develop economic policies that create jobs? It's the most important thing that the Egyptians want, jobs. I mean, what's the Muslim Brotherhood going to do if they enter parliament with a majority or a coalition? How are they going to create jobs? They'll have to think up something. If not, they won't get reelected. Then there's the Egyptian lifestyle. I mean, Egyptians are very fun-loving, and they don't like to be told what to do. So I don't think that a Taliban-type party, which the Muslim Brotherhood isn't, but I don't think it could go in that direction in Egypt. Next, we're going to see all sorts of divisions among Islamist parties. We're already seeing it already. There's some Salafi parties that also are running. They came in second in the first election, and they disagree with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think there's 4 or 5 Islamist parties now in Egypt. So you're going to see division and debate, and hopefully that'll shake down into, well, what do you mean by an Islamist party? What does it mean? What's the place of Islam in public life in this country? Finally, unless there's a coup within the military and we get like a General Zia of Pakistan, the military is going to remain very secular, and it'll put a brake on anything that would get too outrageous that would be suggested by the Brotherhood. So for all these reasons, definitely I foresee that Egypt's going to become a little bit more Islamist, but I don't think it's going to be a catastrophe if the Islamist parties dominate the first parliament. And I'd just like to leave you with something that's totally different, but if you're interested in religion in the Middle East, you should know about it. And that is a rise in sectarianism in the Middle East, but particularly between Sunni Islam and Shiite or Shia Islam. And this is because of Iran's bellicose policies towards the Arab world, and especially the Gulf, its pursuit of alleged pursuit of nuclear weapons. But mainly it's because it's meddling in Arab affairs. And the Arabs are mainly, but not totally, and as you know, Iran is Shiite. So the Saudis, for example, blame the United States for setting the ground for this Shia revival. Why? The United States invaded Iraq. Iraq was run by a Sunni minority. And today, the upshot of the American occupation is that there's, quote, a democracy, elections, and of course it brought a Shiite government to power. And the particular Shiite prime minister right now is very close to Iran. So Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq, right on Saudi Arabia's border, which it never had before. And then, Iran has allies in Lebanon, which have caused problems there for the Saudis because the Hezbollah movement is Shiite and is allied to Iran. And then we have Syria. Syria has been, even though it's predominantly Sunni country, its leadership is a minority religious government, the Alawites, and they were close allies of Iran. So Syria is tottering now, and that'll be bad news for Iran. But what's, I'm getting a little bit too political. What's the upshot of all this? That the tensions between Shiites and Sunnis are really escalating right now in the Middle East, which is not a good sign. So I think I'll stop there and let you ask questions. If you want to know more about my career, I can talk about that too. I don't want to talk too long. Yes?
I'm curious to know, to follow up a little bit about your analysis of the situation in Egypt, and particularly the Muslim, or the Islamic, rather, the Islamist politics. I was there reporting a story in the summer and happened to be there the day that there was a big Islamist rally in Tahrir Square. And it was really striking to see this column of Salafi men walking in and filling the square, in the sense of genuine fear on the part of a lot of the secular people, friends of mine and others. One of the things I was wondering about is part of this seems to, we don't know yet, may come down to kind of a question of coalition politics, parliamentary politics. If the Salafis get together with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is more moderate, so to speak, then there will be a different kind of government, right? Than if the liberals and the secularists manage to come to a coalition with the Muslim Brotherhood. I wonder how you see that. I mean, what prospects you see for that?
I don't know how far the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is very pragmatic, and they don't like to alarm secularists or the West. So I haven't been there to report this, so I don't know whether they're leaning to a coalition with the secularists, or they're just going to go with the Salafis because they're Islamists too, even though they don't agree. But let's say the worst case scenario happens, and it's hugely Islamist coalition dominating a parliament. Well, as I said before, all these other factors are going to come up. You've got to create jobs. Egyptians aren't going to do what you tell them in the same way, the Taliban could tell the Afghan people. It's not going to happen because you have the military, don't forget. And I don't think the military is going to give up their power until they see where the Islamists are going to take Egypt, and they are more relaxed about it. The Muslim Brotherhood keeps saying we want something like Turkey, which, has been a relatively successful model of an Islamic democracy today. So I'm not saying there won't be turbulence ahead. I'm not saying secularists won't at some point feel very marginalized and upset. But I think this is a necessary, catharsis that has to go through, that has to happen in politics in the Middle East. Again, to get to that final destination is, what is the place of Islam in the public life of a modern country? Yes? Did you have a question?
Oh, I did. Can you talk about what sparked your interest in religion in the Middle East?
Well, as I said, I didn't want to go to the Middle East to report on religion. I begged the foreign editor of the Post to send me to the Middle East, and he sent a guy instead. So after that guy's 3 years were up, I begged again, and he let me go. And I was attracted to the challenge of covering a very complicated part of the world. And it was the first time I'd lived in a Muslim country when I went to Egypt the first time. And, as these anecdotes show you, you encounter Islam every day. It's pervasive. So, and after living there for 4 years, it became obvious to me that this is the big issue. And I'm more interested in how religion is played out and the theology of it, rather than the day-to-day politics. So that's what got me interested.
Yes, what are the differences between Sunni and Shia that they keep fighting?
Yeah, it goes back to a disagreement in the first decades after the death of Prophet Muhammad. And there was one group that believed that his successor should be chosen by the consensus of the community. And there was another group that felt that his successor should be through heredity. So I think it was his son-in-law, Ali, claimed that he should lead the Muslims, and the other group disagreed with him. Ali's group went to the area of Iraq, where there was a great battle, the Battle of Karbala. The Sunnis won that. Doctrinally, there's not a lot of difference, except the Shiites believe in that their leader is hidden and will come back. It's sort of like some Christians believe that Jesus is coming back for a second coming. There's nothing like that in Sunni Islam. So, you know, I think the closest comparison is Catholics and Protestants about 400 years ago. You know, there's not that big a difference. They both believe in the 5 pillars of Islam. The Shiites pray a little bit differently from the Sunnis, but the ritual is basically the same. Yes.
Could you assess the importance of Al-Jazeera, the network, in events of the last year in the Muslim world, and also is there any particular view of Al-Jazeera that's held by devout Muslims?
Its influence is huge, and it's doing an amazing job. There are 2 Al-Jazeeras. One's in Arabic, one's in English. Unfortunately, I don't speak Arabic, so I watched the English, and it was the best coverage ever around the world of anybody of the Arab awakening. And they continue to have excellent guests and debate, and it's really amazing. The Arabic Al Jazeera is far more tendentious, far more political, far less professional at getting both sides of the story. But it has a tremendous influence on the ordinary man and woman in the Middle East. When I say tendentious, like it'll pick favorites among the Arab leaders it wants to promote and those it doesn't want to bother with. So, I mean, it's really changed communications in the Arab world.
I'm curious that you haven't mentioned Israel in all of this, so I'm curious if it's become less of an issue now since the Arab awakening, or how do you see that playing in?
Where to begin? The situation is a total catastrophe. Because everybody knows what has to be done to settle the Arab-Israeli dispute. It's there in black and white. And my position is that the Israeli government is stalling and is not even making any attempt to negotiate in good faith with the Palestinians. And it's continuing the settlements, trying to gobble up more and more land to make it increasingly difficult to have a contiguous Palestinian state. Now, what the Arab awakening has done is it's removed all the dictators who didn't want to rock the boat. And that suited Washington, who has backed Israel to the hilt. And so now you can realistically expect that if there's going to be more democracy, any government in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, wherever, they're going to have to be more responsive to what the people want and say about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And in Egypt, for example, which is perhaps the most important country for Israel, public opinion is very much against Israel because they don't see that they've negotiated in good faith. So, you know, if I were advising the Israeli government, I'd say, quickly, do it now. Sit down, talk with the Palestinians, get an agreement, and start moving to diffuse what will be very difficult years ahead if they're going to not come to an agreement. I know that's not a popular position, but that's how I read the situation.
I would love to hear, although I don't want to deflect this really interesting and important discussion, so if people have continued questions along that vein, please do return to it. But I would love to hear about your experiences with GlobalPost and what it was like to, how did it contrast with having been there with Post, and what you think of GlobalPost, which is such an interesting, maybe, I'm sure most people already know about GlobalPost, but I would love to hear you talk.
Yeah, I went to Saudi Arabia. Well, after I left the Post, I worked on the website of the Post for 4 months, putting up On Faith, which is their religion blog. And then I took some time off, and then I wrote to the Saudi embassy and I said, I'd like to go and work in Saudi Arabia as a freelancer. And I fully expected them to say no. Because first of all, I was a single woman. Second of all, I was a freelancer. I had no organization backing me up to go there. So 6 weeks later, I was shocked when they said, fine, go ahead. And now I was lucky because my request came at a time when the Saudis were trying to influence or invite more foreign correspondents to come and live there. Because they finally realized if they would have correspondents come and live there, they would get better coverage. Rather than giving somebody a 2-week visa, person comes in, sits in their hotel room half the time waiting for appointments with officials, then leaves and goes out to a shopping mall, interviews a taxi driver, and writes a very superficial story. I mean, you can't do anything but. So I did have the Christian Science Monitor willing to take my stories. And then when I got there, the National in Abu Dhabi started up. And they wanted me to be their Riyadh correspondent. And that was great. And then about 10 months later, after I was there, Charles Sennett called me and told me about GlobalPost starting. And so I became their Riyadh correspondent. So those are my 3 main strings when I was in Riyadh. I loved working for GlobalPost because they took anything I gave them.
They bragged constantly about having you too. The first time I ever talked to Charlie, he said, "You do know who we."
They didn't pay much, but I figured I wanted my byline in an American publication. And I was excited by GlobalPost because it was the first one that started up from scratch as an online publication for foreign news, and had a really smart financial guy behind it, Phil Balboni. I mean, he made his money off of New England cable news. And a really smart guy in the editorial side, Charlie Sennett. And they were, great to work for, very appreciative, took anything I sent them. They didn't pay much, but what they did was they gave everybody who started there as a correspondent some shares. And, if you're optimistic, you think maybe when I'm in my rocking chair, these shares, if GlobalPost ever goes public, they'll be worth something. I mean, back in, I think, the 50s or 60s, reporters at the Washington Post were given shares in the company. And then after Watergate and after the Washington Post became so famous, they all became millionaires. There weren't very many of them, but there were a few. I wasn't one of them, so. What GlobalPost has done now, I think they started out by having too many correspondents. They had about 70 all over the world, and they were getting a lot of content. And the content didn't seem to have much, it was hard for the reader to decide, is this important content or is this just fun content? So what they did about a year ago was kind of reduce the number of regular contributors and also do more investigative series like the one I did on Saudi Arabia with Charles. So I have a good feeling about them. I think that they're going to make it as an online publication devoted to foreign news. So, and A lot of people, because of me, a lot of people came to know it in Saudi. Because every time I wrote a story as a stringer, I always sent it by email after it was published to the people I'd interviewed for it. I think it's an important way to establish your credibility, because instead of being interviewed by someone and then they never hear from you again, they see the end product. So when you have to call them the next time, they know that you're a serious person and it's worthwhile talking to you.
Carol, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it was like as a single American non-Muslim woman to work in Saudi. I'm thinking about your stories for the GlobalPost on covering Saudi women and some of their struggles. I mean, how were you treated as just like a visitor from another planet? So,
yeah, well, first of all, just after I got there, they rescinded the rule that a single woman didn't have to have a letter from her guardian to stay in a hotel. You know, the idea was if you were a single woman going to a hotel, you were a prostitute. But Saudi women, you know, to the government's credit, no longer can go and stay. They can, if she's a businesswoman, she can fly from Jeddah to Riyadh and get a room in a hotel without having a letter from her husband saying, I'm not a prostitute. I lived on a compound. Most foreigners live on a compound. It just makes life a little bit easier. The compound had a restaurant and pools and a gym, and it was all foreigners. Most of the people in my compound were Lebanese, Egyptian, American, Spaniards. It was very cosmopolitan. And this, because of the Al-Qaeda campaign in 2003, this was guarded by army soldiers, so that there'd be no more attacks on, because you know, Western compounds became a focus of the Al-Qaeda campaign, a target for them. But foreign women are given a lot of slack. Like, for example, every woman has to wear the black robe over her regular clothes when she goes out in public. And even though it was Riyadh, which is conservative, I did not cover my head. I didn't I didn't wear a scarf. Unless I went to a government office, or I was interviewing a cleric, or I was interviewing someone who you want to show special respect to. But if I went to the mall, I didn't wear a scarf, and I never got bothered by the religious police. If I'd been a Saudi woman, I probably would have gotten harassed by the religious police. They'd say, cover your face or cover your hair. And a lot of women in Riyadh do wear the niqab, the face veil. They don't do it so much in Riyadh, in Jeddah. Because I was a foreigner, an American, and you know, I had a past in the Washington Post, people took me seriously. So there's only, there were a couple of events that I was told I couldn't come to because it was just for men. One event I pitched up anyway and argued that I should be let in because the Ministry of Interior was there and I wanted to cover this, so they relented. And I went in and I was allowed to sit in this auditorium that was filled with like 3,000 men, and I was the only woman there. It was a very weird feeling. Of course, I couldn't drive.
you couldn't drive?
No women are allowed to drive.
But that's what I meant. I thought maybe because you weren't Muslim, you could drive.
No. I mean, out in the boondocks, Bedouin women, they drive their pickup trucks. The government doesn't say anything about that because they know if they tried to stop those women from driving, first of all, it would be an economic hardship on the families because these are working women. They're farming or they're, you know, transporting cattle to the market, and they'd upset the Bedouins. So that goes on. But in the cities, you know, there's a ban on female drivers per se. So I had to have a driver. And luckily, I found a good one. And he would come when I needed him. And he did other jobs. And if he couldn't come, he'd send one of his friends. He was from India. You know, this is a funny thing about the ban on driving. Saudi women aren't supposed to be alone with a man they're not married to or who's not closely related to them. But because of the ban on driving, they all have foreign drivers, you know, Egyptians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, so they're in the car.
In this small space alone.
Yeah, yeah. But it gets blinked at.
So if you were a young journalist sitting in this room and you were contemplating your career, what kind of advice did you have, and did you tell people to go? You went and struck out on your own when you started in Africa. I mean, is that still a good plan, or?
I think so. You know, it's really hard to get a job in journalism in the United States. And if you're a stringer and you go overseas, you want to go to a place that has two criteria, which is one of the reasons I chose Riyadh, because it had these two criteria. You want to go to a place where editors still are interested in the news. And believe me, there's huge appetite among American editors for news from Saudi Arabia. It's a huge, important country that's undercovered by foreign journalists. And the second criteria is you want to go where there's not much competition. Now, Cairo and Beirut, they're nicer places to live. You can have a glass of wine every night, not in Riyadh. But there are hundreds and hundreds of journalists trying to make a name for themselves by being stringers in Beirut and Cairo. So, yeah, I think it's still a good way to do it. Of course, you'd want to make contacts here, so when you get over there and you email them, they know who you are. And I think the other thing that's really important is if you're a journalism student, to spend most of your holidays and vacations working at a newspaper or a TV station. So, you know, people can get to know you, so you can build up a portfolio of stories you've written or worked on. I know it's very hard today. It's much harder than when I started in journalism.
Would you tell them a little bit about when you left your hometown newspaper and went abroad?
Yeah, when I finally decided I wanted to be a journalist, I got a job at my hometown newspaper in Brockton, Massachusetts. And, you know, unfortunately, I was working for the society editor, and she had me writing up little stories about someone's bridal shower and the wedding and what the bride wore, and I was totally bored. So I quit after 10 months, and I saved my money. I said, I'm going back to Africa, because I'd been there earlier as a teacher. And I was headed for South Africa, because I figured, where will I hire a white woman to be working on a newspaper in Africa? But I decided on the way to South Africa, I was going to stop in Angola, because when I'd lived in Kenya as a teacher, I'd always heard these stories about Angola, this beautiful place, very secretive. You know, it was ruled by the Portuguese, but the Portuguese Revolution had happened, and Portugal had announced that it was going to free Angola and Mozambique. They were going to become independent countries. So I said, well, I'll just go and visit Angola for 2 weeks, and then I'll go on my way to South Africa. So after, I remember I arrived, I only had like $150 in my pocket, so I started teaching English to earn money. And I was there for a couple of months, and I said, okay, it's time to move on. And I was about to leave the next day for South Africa, and this guy I had befriended at the American Embassy in Angola, he came to say goodbye to me. He said, Carol, you know, if I were you, I wouldn't go to South Africa. I'd stay right here. I said, why? He said, well, first of all, there's lots of correspondents already in South Africa, and there aren't very many here. And secondly, I think this place is going to be very interesting. And lo and behold, war broke out.
Yeah. What year was this?
This was 75.
I lived in Kinshasa at that time, and we couldn't go to Angola.
Yeah. So I got a lot of strings, and one of the strings was Newsweek, and at that time Newsweek was the company that owned Newsweek also owned the Washington Post. So the Washington Post began looking for a stringer in Angola, and Newsweek recommended me. So I started stringing for the Post, and then I got arrested by the government because they thought I was working for the CIA. Because what is this? Well, how did this woman get here? What is she doing here? You know. So I was put under house arrest 10 days and then kicked out of the country. So I called the post and I said, well, I have no money and I've just been kicked out of Angola. And they said, okay, we'll give you a ticket. I was kicked out because of the story I wrote for you. So they gave me airfare to come home. And they put me on probation. They offered me a job with probation for 6 months. I passed probation. And that was how I got connected to the Post. And then, so I've come full circle. I started out as a stringer, and I'm now a stringer again. So, any other questions?
Yeah, one more. I was just getting back to some of your analysis of things. If you talk to some people, in the Middle East would say one of the reasons for the they'll say my mom used to wear miniskirts, or was back. You look at pictures from the 70s, and you don't have anywhere near this kind of conservative dress. And some people will say, well, that's partly because the U.S. This is a little overly simplistic, I think, but they will argue, well, the U.S. propped up these dictatorships for all this time, and they repressed the secular option, and so that the descent went into the mosque, and that was the rise of political Islam can be traced in part to the repression of secular democratic politics. I mean, what's your view?
Well, no,
do you think that's sort of overly simplistic?
Well, I think the U.S. definitely had a role in, I hate to use the word propping up because it wasn't like the Vietnamese government in South Vietnam. No, I mean, these regimes were propped up by their own tough, brutal security systems. The U.S. wanted stability, so it put up with a lot of authoritarianism. On the other hand, every year it came out with very tough human rights reports by the State Department. So it's all there in black and white on the internet. People can go back and see what the U.S. really thought about these regimes. Now, what did they do about them? Well, no. They weren't going to go in and overthrow them and cause chaos. The U.S. government never does that. Unless they perceive a regime as being allied to their enemy, like they did in Guatemala years ago. But yeah, these governments, they said they were secular, but they repressed everybody. They repressed the secularists, and they did repress the Islamists, especially the Muslim Brotherhood. So. But this conservative drift of Muslim societies, especially in Egypt, goes way back to the early 70s. Right. And, after Israel...
After 67.
After 67, after Israel won that war, this was another huge psychological catastrophe for the Arab Muslim world. How could God let this happen to us? It's because we weren't religious enough. And that's the conclusion that a lot of Muslims came to. So they became more religious in every way. I don't see how Egypt can get a lot more Islamist than it is. You've been there. You see that the women, unless it becomes compulsory to wear hijab, for example. But I just don't see the Brotherhood doing that.
No. The Salafis would like to, though.
The Salafis would? Yeah. Sure they would. But, even in Saudi Arabia now, women are rejecting that.
Interesting.
So, they're rejecting, not the veil, they're rejecting being told they have to wear it. So maybe I'm too optimistic about the outcome of the Arab awakening, but I hope not, because if we just go back to another authoritarian regime with more Islamic flavor, we're not going to get anywhere. So if we want to see, and the people in the Muslim Arab world, they are so creative. You see it now on the internet. they're so creative, but they need to have an economic base and a moral base for this creativity to come out and to be allowed to flower.
What's your sense of the American public's view of Islam? Has it changed? Is it, do we really know what the American public writ large thinks? I don't know.
Yeah, I get so discouraged when I go and read the stuff that's on the internet. I mean, the Islamophobia is outrageous. And, even on some television channels like Fox News, it's just, I'm not going to say Fox News is Islamophobic, but they're certainly ignorant of Islam. The ignorance of Islam is still pretty big in the United States. On the other hand, there's been a lot more willingness and curiosity since 9/11 by many Americans to learn about Islam. And I think there's a larger percentage of people who are knowledgeable and not frightened by Islam. But still, we've got to worry about this other big sector that's so vociferous and so loud, especially on the internet. And it doesn't do any good for anybody. Because nowadays, just look at the Republican debate and the way they spoke about Iran. Well, we'll just bomb them. Can't let them have a bomb. It's so simplistic, and people, a little editor of a small newspaper in Pakistan and Iran, they're reading this on the internet, and so they form their ideas about the United States from statements like this, and it's just very bad, very bad. That's why Obama's speech was so fabulous in Cairo. He just said all the right thing, and he told the truth. Unfortunately, he hasn't followed up in realistic policies to match those words. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you for coming.